Aloha golfers! This is Golf in the Cosmos, episode number 2. All things macogrady and MORAD. My name is Kevin Rabowski. I'm a PGA professional here in Hawaii. I have a golf school, the KMR School of Golf, and you can visit me in person or online, take some lessons. Love to help and share the MORAD ideas and philosophy. So I know there's a lot of you out there interested, and if so, please support this podcast, this program, by subscribing to my channel and pressing like to this video. I'd like to definitely keep improving and do this more on a regular basis to help all those MORAD enthusiasts out there and maybe clarify some ideas that have gotten maybe muddled over the generations. And I think that's going to be very beneficial, not only to the MORAD people, but to golfers in general. I'd like to have a very special guest come on quite soon, so that'll be a big announcement, and I'm working on it, hoping to get someone that was very instrumental in the MORAD project in the beginning. So stay tuned, we'll do an interview format, hopefully the next episode. This episode, we are going to cover, I guess, some maybe controversial subjects. Maybe controversial is not the right word, but basically topics in the golf swing model from MORAD that have been maybe changed and now have some maybe misunderstanding. And there's probably quite a few topics that we should cover. But today we are going to dedicate the topic to the stance. And you might think, well, that's such a basic thing, why spend so much detail? But this is extremely pivotal for the swing, and basically your stance is going to be called part of the motor set, which was again original macogrady 1986 MORAD model. Basically one of the elements that really at address that forms the blueprint of the swing. So we have these characteristics at setup that are going to set in motion the motor skill. And so the stance is extremely important. Mac goes into quite a bit of detail in the 1986 video that I posted when he's in shorts. And he's talking a lot about the foot flare. Obviously there's a lot more to stance than that. But that's a good place to start, so I think that's an appropriate starting point. So when it comes to foot flare, basically the amount, if any, that your feet are angled out or in. And so basically in the 86 MORAD model, the swing is primarily governed by rotation. We're going to rotate up the plane, back down the plane, and through. What helps create a very centered and balanced rotation is having the appropriate amount of foot flare. And so in the original model, the right foot was flared out 10 degrees. Why? So you can turn your hips 45, your shoulders 90, and keep both eyes on the ball staying in the middle of the visual field. That's the reason. Now, 10 degrees is an arbitrary number. That could vary from person to person based on their flexibility. But that's just a starting point again, just a number to throw out, just to create the idea that with your foot angled to the right, it helps free up the hip so that you can turn minimum 45 degrees. And again, that can also change a little bit based on the club that you're hitting. The left foot, again, the similar idea, although it's going to rotate more, probably double, 20 to 25 degrees out to the left, again, somewhere in that range. Why? So that you can get the full 90-degree hip rotation so that you're square to the target in the finish. Right? So the left foot doesn't guarantee that you're going to make the full hip rotation, but the left hip combined with straightening the left knee will then allow your hips to fully rotate. And so to me, the foot flare is governing rotation. Now, in the 86 video, Mac talks a lot more about how the foot flare controls the slide, where if you have your feet at right angles, right? Your hip might slide to the right and slide to the left too much. And yeah, I definitely see there could be some truth in that. Definitely with your feet at right angles, pointing directly at the target line, it's not comfortable for the brain to want to turn the body. As soon as you start to turn, the right foot starts to buckle to the outside, you're going to lose your balance, the brain's going to pick that up. So the more probably easier movement to do would be to slide the hip with the right foot at the right angles, and then vice versa. And so Mac talked a lot about how the different foot positions, 1, 2, or 3, can, what clubs they were good for. I would say the easiest way to approach the foot flare is, again, to have that basic 10 and 25 degree right foot, left foot alignment. And you might vary the foot flare based on curvature of the ball. So if you had let's say your right foot turned out 30, 40, 45 degrees out to the right, you're going to open up your hips a lot quicker and faster, and that's going to delay your release. So generally, if you want to fade the ball, I would say open up your foot more than 25, and you'll increase your hip clearance, you'll increase your hip speed, and that's going to delay your release. You're going to be holding out a lot longer, and that would encourage more of an intentional fade. And vice versa. If I put my left foot in more, let's say 0 degrees rotated, or just maybe a slight bit amount, it's going to really restrict the amount I can rotate my hips. My left leg, my left knee is going to be in the way, literally. And that's going to slow down my hip speed, and it's also going to keep my hips more closed, and that's going to speed up my wrist action. And this club's going to turn over a lot faster. So you will hear, I think, people describe how they draw or fade the ball with their left foot position. And I think there's some merit to that as well. It's probably a little more that you could get into with swing path, but I think that's a good way to effectively curve the ball without changing too many other things and not being, obviously bogged down by too much thought. So foot flare, I think that would be my take on it, and I think it's very logical. What's a little more complicated is the width of the stance. So this can get really muddled if you really, depending on what era you're looking at the MORAD swing. 1986, without a doubt, Mac played from a variable width stance. And I think most of us do to some degree. If we're hitting, let's say, a 60-yard lob wedge, we're going to probably play from a quite narrower stance, and then incrementally it gets wider until they get to the driver. In the 86 videos, this was very apparent in Mac's swing. You would see him hitting the short irons with the feet only maybe 4 or 5 inches apart, a little bit duck-footed, and then with the driver, extreme width in the stance. So this idea that, he created in the checklist that the feet should be 18 inches apart, and again, that would be from heel to heel, that definitely changed based on what club that he was hitting and maybe a little bit of what kind of trajectory he wanted to hit as well. So this was in the 86 modeling. In the 90s, again, it's kind of all over the place. So I've seen videos where, again, everything is pretty wide, and I see Mac, doing a little bit more of a hip slide. So what's happening when you widen your stance? Okay, so this is a good kind of point to go over. So if I widen my stance, generally speaking, I'm going to create more shoulder slant to the right. So that's torso tilt number 2, right? The tilt to the shoulders to the right, right? And that generally is a high ball characteristic. And what it's also going to do is it's going to not necessarily make me slide in the backswing, because I can still turn, but when I shift my weight to my left foot to get there, I've got to create a lot more hip slide. And again, it's going to almost increase torso tilt number 2, and again, create very high shots, especially for driver, right, where you have the ball on the tee to begin with, so it's conducive to hitting off a driver. With all that hip slide and weight shift, definitely you're putting a more mass of your body into the hit. And so again, kind of a very power producing effect when you widen your stance. You're going to see the longest drivers of the golf ball with very wide stances. I don't see an exception to that. I don't see a very, very long hitter playing from a narrow stance. So you can take a look at that. And again, I think you're going to see from the wide stance extra torso tilt number 2, and even a little bit, you're going to see the right hand wanting to get a little bit under, right? Because as you drop that shoulder, it feels better for the elbow and the hand to kind of get inward like this, and then you might be prone to shutting the face slightly from there. So these are little points, right? The little quirks of all these interconnections of how the anatomy works and the blueprint for address to the swing. So to counter that, there was also times in the 90s, I've seen videos where Mac advocated everything a very narrow stance. I mean, 8 inches apart, narrow. And the reasoning being was it eliminates all slide. Basically, it's just all you can do is turn. Right, and his points were it keeps you centered, it gives your swing a certain lightness, and definitely easy on the brain. So if you think about how, with the wide stance and all that hip slide, right, there's a lot more work the brain has to do to coordinate impact, right? So I would say the benefit of the wide stance is added power, but the detriment to the wide stance obviously is variability. You can start spraying it, you can mishit it, it can get very frustrating trying to coordinate the rotation and the hip slide and the release. It becomes a lot more work to do that from shot to shot. Conversely, narrowing your stance has a very kind of lightening of the swing, but also gives you an easy pattern to repeat, right? So the brain doesn't have to work so hard. There's not much you can do here, right? I'm just going to simply turn and turn. There's a little weight shift, but because the feet are so close together, you barely feel it. And I think this point was also made in the 80s, but with the driver, Mac certainly would vary it. And I think when Mac wanted to demonstrate very long hitting, his feet got extra wide. There are photos of him with the driver in the 80s with the feet, I would say 18 inches apart. And maybe that was more what he would call the standard model, and then the variation would be to go 24 inches apart to get it higher and longer. So that's probably some of the reasoning there. So what's right for you? I would say, some experimentation would always be good. If you're already a very long hitter, try narrowing your stance if you want to be a fairway finder, more accuracy on the par threes. You might lose a club in distance, but certainly there's something to gain when the swing is easier to repeat. If you're looking to add more distance, definitely with the driver, I would encourage you to widen the stance, give it a go, and see how it feels. I don't think you can hit extremely long without having a wide stance. And I would say then it's probably for the majority of us, they're somewhere in the middle. In the yoga world, we like to stack the joints for optimal balance. So that would be basically your feet directly under your knees, knees under your hips, hips under your shoulders. You create these two vertical lines, stacking the joints, gives you optimal balance, gives you centeredness, and sort of minimizes the slide all in one. And so that's probably the happy medium with the foot flare, again, 10 degrees and maybe 20, 25 degrees on the left. So that would be my preference. And but that kind of goes over some of the intricacies of the width of the stance, which you know, can be quite interesting in terms of how it relates to swing pattern. The other aspect, when you look at widening the stance, it will create the shoulder tilt. It also will create the head tilt. So it's much harder with a wide stance to get right on top of it, right? It will generally create that little lean to the right. Okay, next point is the alignment of the stance. And again, this changed over time, where Mac in '86, I think he played from the majority of the time with a slightly open stance, which would make sense. His preferred ball flight was fade, and I think Mac set up with his feet slightly left of the target, and ball position was very far up. So if you look at the photos of Mac, his hands are slightly behind the ball at address. The ball's way up here. He's got the slant to the right, you know, something like that. Ball is extremely far forward, feet are slightly left. He's got the slant to the right. He's playing a 7-degree driver, 7.5 degree driver, right? And he's launching that ball up, and it's knuckling. And he's got all of the blueprint at address set up for fade. So that's basically the stance is left of the target line. The starting line is going to be left, and he's going to delay his release, and he's going to spin his hips, and that club's going to be just slightly open, and ball's going to curve to the right, and very powerfully as well. So another interesting point, when you do vary your stance width, you may have to then look at the loft and the shaft flex. So I would say when you play from a very wide stance and you create that shoulder tilt and you play the ball up, you're going to need a very low lofted driver. You're probably going to pick up club head speed, and you're going to need maybe one flex more. Then when you get into, if you want to narrow your stance, right, you're probably going to stay more on top of it, and you might need a more lofted driver. You're probably not going to generate the kind of club head speed. You might actually have to go down a flex. So equipment then has to, you know, realign with these setup adjustments, and then how that affects your swing, and not only club head speed but launch angle. So it can be quite tricky when we start tinkering around in these areas, right? So Mac changed the alignment of the stance in the 90s. I want to say maybe around 93, 94, I started to hear this. Maybe a little bit when he started to work with Sebi, in particular, 93, 94. Mac started advocating a closed stance for everything. So basically the idea was you drop your right foot back a couple inches. It's going to allow the hand path to come inside, right? So Mac advocated hand path inside. Not only did he say it was okay for the hands to go inside, he advocated hands to go to the inside. Club head still stays outside, so it lines up at P2, parallel to the target line or the base of the plane line. Right? So the reason why the hands should go inside is right away you're going to get the turn, right? So the hands are following the body's rotation. So they're working dependently, not independently. Hands going down the line, right? The hands follow the turning of the body, so they goes to the inside, and you get this nice turn, right? The big muscles are in charge, right? And so that was the idea. When you look at it from this direction, close the stance, hands come to the inside, then the hands going through the base of the humerus bone, and the shaft through the base of the humerus bone. Then we go up, nice big stretch. At this point, 90s, club was pretty much still down the line, right? And then Mac advocated the hand path shift outward from P4 to P5. The shaft fall back, right? So still, you know, tracing the plane line, right? So here's the club head shifting out. We don't want to do that. But the hand path shifted out. the club head laid back, right? Then the club shaft goes through the middle part of the humerus bone, right? Lines right up at P6, and Mac's spinning out of the way, holding on, right? Creating what he called CF fades. CP fades. So centripetal force, swinging to the left, trying to create a left to right shot, which was his, desired ball flight pattern. So we'll go into CF and CP at another video, but this again started in the 90s. This swinging inside out, centrifugal force, swinging left for centripetal force. Now we can discuss that in great detail in another video, but that all happened in the 90s. And so again, this was probably a bit of a shock maybe to some of the 80s players, and maybe not as comfortable. So in the 80s swing, we're basically rotation around a centered axis and a fixed point, both eyes on the ball in the center of the visual field, and we're rotating the club up the plane and then back down the plane and then through the plane, right? So the plane being at this time, shaft at address, pointing at the ball, behind the ball, on the base of the plane line or the target line, if you're going to hit it straight, right? And then take away, the shaft is parallel to the target line. Halfway back, P3, section 3, the shaft is tracing the plane line or the target line. Section 4 at the top, pointing, tracing, back to pointing parallel to the target line, back to pointing at the ball, impact, and then it's parallel, tracing, parallel, and tracing. Right? So basically the swing plane is either parallel to the target line or tracing it, pointing to it. So that was the real basic idea of the swing plane. So let me interject this at this point, because in the 86 version of MORAD, the swing really was about trying to keep it the simplest possible for the body and the brain to perform this action called the golf swing. And the idea was we just incorporate a few basic principles, maybe 5 things: rotation, centeredness, connection, this idea of release, going up the plane, down the plane, and that's about it. And then when you're performing the act, trying to shut off all or most conscious thought, right? So this was the goal neurologically of MORAD, right? Because Mac knew about how the neurology worked when you're doing motor skills, right? You don't want to be overthinking it. And so again, this is an irony, because Mac's reputation over time was that he made the swing very complicated, but this was not the original intention of MORAD. And in fact, it was to go into automatic pilot. And there's things that he did at address in the pre-shot routine, both with the waggle, priming the muscles, and the count. So he swung on a count, which basically distracted all conscious thought. And all there was to the swing was the waggle and the count. And then you're just relying completely on muscle memory, which is nothing more than another way of saying habit, right, through all these repetitions. And most of the time when you work with players in the 80s, it was just to clean up what they had. So basically, people swing like Chip Beck, Dan Forsman, they didn't look exactly like Mac, right? But they applied the same principles to their body and their anatomy and the size of their limbs and their flexibility, and they interpreted the MORAD system in their own way. And they were successful. So there was a lot of validity and credibility, in that era. But when we start getting into this shift with the alignment, so in other words, now we're no longer parallel to the target line in the 90s. We're dropping that right foot back, which makes us think we're going to hit it to the right. So again, there's some a little bit of a fight there in the brain, right? We're no longer setting up parallel to our intended target line. And now we've got to deal with this loop, right? So we're bringing the hands in to turn the body, fully coil, and then we're shifting it back out so we can hit fades, right? So having to deal with that. And again, that kind of probably created some resistance with some of the players and teachers. And of course, Mac, advocated and promoted MORAD to a whole new generation of teachers and players. And, so there was no big deal. Mac just simply let go of the old and then brought on the new. And, he had a lot of interest. Of course, the way Mac explained things and demonstrated, he very, very convincing. So, but I don't think 1993, 1994, 2003, 2004, 2010, 2015 macogrady could convince 1986 macogrady of those principles, right? Nuh-uh. So, so there was, we have this whole changing of the guard and evolution of Mac's thought process. And of course, it's, he went, like a lot of us, just based on our age and our experience, we think of things a certain way at one time frame, and then it changes, and then we may go back to it too. So, I see evidence of that as well. Next thing that involves the stance, and then stance is not only the feet, but it incorporates the legs as well. And I won't incorporate the hips and the upper torso because that'll be videos to come. But another controversial subject were the knees. Are the knees, pinched in? Are they out? And again, it's really varied over time. Actually, 86 Mac would advocate, at least with the irons, the short irons, right before he took the club back, P1 to P2, he would, pinch in the legs, tighten the legs, maybe tighten the arms a little bit. And this idea that little firming up or tightening will basically kind of govern the motion a little bit more. And for some people that tend to maybe move around, move off the ball, that might not be a bad idea. But again, you could certainly overdo that, especially if you start going into kind of like this kind of Jim Colbert, maybe, which was advocated by, maybe the Hogan idea of kind of everything really pinched in. When I pinch my knees in, they're no longer pointing in the same direction of my feet. So my meniscus already feels it. I feel it in my hips and in my lower back. So anatomically, pinching your knees in, not healthy, right? So a healthy knee position should be knees over the feet, and the knees should be pointing in the direction of the feet. So this is much healthier on the body, and it's so important for the sequencing of the swing. So there was a blip in time where, and I think, you could say it as simply as this. There was a time where Mac was maybe experimenting or maybe deciding whether he liked the Hogan knees or the Snead knees. Right? I think it's that simple. So Hogan more pinched in, Snead more bowed out, and then bowed out became in favor. Definitely when I started working with Mac in 1991, I started to do it intensively with Mac. Knees were bowed out. So with the knees bowed out, what you have is you lower your center of gravity, you create some stability. So the idea would be you sit back, someone came over and tried to push you, they couldn't push you over because you were rock solid, right? Knees are flexed, thighs are engaged, and slightly bowed out. Now, how this helps with sequencing is, again, my foot flare is out as well to the right 10 degrees. I'm going to turn my hips 45 degrees, shoulders 90. And when I come down, right, my left leg is going to kind of lead the way. My right leg is just going to stay back a blip, right? So my right knee is still going to point slightly to the right, and that allows my arms to come back down in front, like this. So my right knee has got to stay a little bit out, P4, P5, even P6, and not start jamming in here like this, where my elbow gets trapped behind me, right? So that's very important. So if you start off with the knees pinched in, it's like you're running 100 meters, right? On the starting gate, right? With your foot braced against at that angle, and the knee is kicked in, right? You start going back, right? It's going to limit your backswing, but then also it's going to fire right away. So you're going to look like that. And we see a lot of players, good players sometimes look like that, right? So the hips are out of sequence. The right knee is firing too fast. Right? So with the right knee pointing out in the more bow-legged position, you see this in Dustin Johnson. Then the knee will stay in that position as the left starts to move towards the target. That keeps with the knee open, that gives me the space to bring my arm back in front of my hip. So hold on the angle, and then boom, they can go all together. Left knee can kick in, right knee can kick in, left knee can straighten, and then I can fully release it. So again, knees bowed out, P1 to P2, P4, P4 to P5, P4 to P6. The left knee leads the way, the right knee stays back. Bam, then we'll go right through it. So that's a very lost point in the MORAD system. So something that you might think about, and that would be something that I would advocate, and that's something that I do for myself. So that's worthwhile to explore. The last point when it comes to stance that I'm going to make is the amount of knee flex. So Mac's kind of trademark signature look at address was he had a lot of knee flex and he had low hands. And knees, bowed out in some generations, right? But, knee flex, again, was a stabilizer. So the amount of knee flex was significant because, again, lowers the center of gravity, creates stability, and then it's conducive to low hands. So Mac advocated low hands in the 80s, 86 model. The idea would be if you had a table, an overhanging table, your hands would be right under that table, and you could swing the club keeping the hands under the table. So basically the shaft feels real low at address. Go to P4, come back down P6, and then you're trying to return the shaft right back to the original angle. Hands stay under that table, just swing it completely around the arc, and then you go straight up. Right, so that was the idea. Right, now, your hands aren't going to exactly do that, because centrifugal force is so powerful that it's going to uncock your wrist a little bit and raise that shaft angle. And that does it without any conscious thought, right? And it's stronger as the club gets longer. So that's one of the reasons why the longer clubs probably easier to push, driver in particular, and then lob wedge, sand wedge, easier to go left, right? Less centrifugal force, your hands don't raise up as much. So perhaps the lie angle, right? That's something that you have to pay attention to with this. Could be slightly toe up, right? So definitely toe up at address because we have low hands, but it's going to be pretty flat at impact with the majority of the clubs, right? Because of the centrifugal pull. The pull, which basically raises the hands up, and you're coming out of torso tilt number 1, right? So you're bent over at address, torso tilt number 1. We start our rotation up to the top and create a side bend. Then we come back. We return to torso tilt number 1. We add torso tilt number 2. And we come out of torso tilt number 1. So we lose the waist bend, but we kick in torso tilt number 2, which is the side bend, right? So you're going to be a little taller at impact than you were at address, right? Now, there are exceptions to this rule, and it gets kind of complicated because golfers that are laid off at the top, if that shaft's pointing above the plane line, especially P5, they're going to have to go down, they're going to lower their posture. And then their impact posture is going to look very similar to their address posture. So you'll see that with Hogan and Sergio. And some teachers will make a case, look at your impact and address, Nick Price is another one. Your impact and address posture should be the same. Those are exceptions to the rule, and generally, I've only seen this happen when the shaft at P5 is above the plane line, right? Then the golfer has to lower down their posture to make contact. Otherwise, the club gets thrown above the ball, right? And you miss it or top it. Right? So that's some of the explanation there, why sometimes the impact posture and the address posture look similar, but most of the time, 99% of the time with golfers, professional golfers, does not, especially with the driver, right? And then we can go into this whole thing about the pelvic extension and how that has been misinterpreted as well. So that will be another point for another day, but that's definitely a subject that we can touch upon. But knee flex, I think somewhere probably in the middle range. I like to feel my hands low. It helps me feel like I can get this vertical wrist hinge, right? And, you know, I like this feeling, right? This idea that I could cock the club up, right? And then basically turn and turn, keeping my arms connected to my chest. That's the feel. That's the dominant feel I have in my swing. And the low hands helps me achieve that. Now you start looking at Mac in the 2000s, especially later 2000s, he's returning back to Homer Kelly and the golfing machine. Hands very high, forearm on the shaft plane, very little knee flex, and then coming back, tracing the plane line. So just basically one plane up, one plane down. You know, with the shaft angle at address, trying to match the shaft angle at impact. So that's raised up, right? Right elbow's on the shaft plane, left wrist is flat, and going back, coming up, you know, pretty sharp here, P1 to P2, and then almost widening it from P2 to P4, then sharpening it again from P4 down to P6. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot to think about, right? And so I've seen those videos, and I've cringed quite a few times, only because of, you know, how, you know, strong Mac felt in the 80s against this, right? Where Mac basically strongly advocated the low hands position and the reasons why. And so now, you know, he returned back to the original teachings from the golfing machine and taught golf schools that way. So, you know, again, it's a big change, especially if you grew up or you did the older MORAD swing, to continuously make these sort of updates of MORAD. I think that's basically what Matt called them. And again, I think more likely those were just his, in any period of time, the way he was thinking or approaching it at that moment, probably using himself as a guinea pig often, you know, and then, you know, using what worked, disregarding what didn't work, and, you know, maybe rethinking all of these things. Perhaps this is a reason why he hasn't published the material, just constantly not satisfied, and is just rethinking the ideas over and over again. So, but definitely you're going to see this change in the MORAD modeling with the hand position and the shaft position, and you never know, you know, if it returned back to low or not. But for my own personal use, I like the lower hands. I like the feeling of going back under the table, trying to return the club back to the original shaft angle at address. Although it doesn't, we know centrifugal force raises it up. You're not going to be toe up at impact, probably. And if you were, the ball's going to go left. Right? So I think that's another reason Mac kind of advocated the higher hands, was the fact that now the club head is flat on the ground at address, so that it's easier to hit straight. Of course, you know, when it's flat on the ground at address, and then you get that droop at impact, the raising of the hands, then it's going to be toe down. So, you know, that I think is, I haven't, you know, heard his reason to counteract that point. But that being besides the issue, it's just giving you an overview of the evolution of how the stance changed in the MORAD model, and basically give you some maybe ideas to think about or rethink. Again, especially I think with the width of the stance, that is particularly interesting when you create narrow stance, right? We're creating rotation, a lot more cocking and recocking of the wrist, right? Minimal weight shift, rotation, centeredness, connection. That's a very attractive look, and if you're going to play like a machine, I would advocate that. Now, if you want to bomb it, right, hit bombs, right, you got to get up here, got to get that ball forward, got to create some tilt, got to use a low lofted driver, high T, stiff, extra stiff shafts, and then you can start, generating some speed, but then you also generate the fall balls too. So, yep, it's hard to say how much of this affected Mac's performance, constantly, changing characteristics, right? And hard to say. But anyway, we're all on our own journey to find out what works for us. And this whole podcast and this episode involving the stance as the topic, but the other topics as well to come, these are just basically here for your own educational purposes, right? Maybe you won't have to spend a fortune on lesson taking, right? You can use these videos and use them for ideas to help you with your swing. We all have to dig it out of our dirt, right? I don't want to be, and I didn't want to be a mini Mac copycat, right? I want to use those principles and the way my body interprets them and do it in a very athletic and intuitive way, right? Which means no thinking, right? Or less conscious thinking. And I'm very happy and very pleased with the way that I swing now, and it gives me no source of stress or trepidation. Now, putting and taking it to unfamiliar courses and playing in all kinds of conditions, this is what makes golf so unique. Probably the most unique of sports is that we do not play golf on a grid, right? The grid is constantly changing. The surface is constantly changing. The conditions are constantly changing. So we've got to be able to adapt. Our game must travel, right? And again, I think that's what leads us to this more consistent modeling and a model that's going to be more machine-like. So machine-like means you don't have to think. You have a routine. You set up. You hit one after the other like a machine spitting out bottle caps. That's the goal. So anyway, I'm glad that a lot of you are watching, and if you want to reach out to me, please feel free, and certainly subscribe and like the videos so that we can keep this going. Again, I'm working on an incredible guest, right? The most incredible guest besides Mac himself, that could really share a lot of knowledge and insight into the MORAD model and the origins of it. But this is still to be confirmed. So please stay tuned, and I wish you all good golfing. Thank you.